Welcome to Brain Navat. We are delighted to be joined by Agnes Callard, who I think is one of the truly great public philosophers and has written a wonderful book on Socrates and on the case for living a philosophical life. So, Agnes, instead of asking you to start with a thought experiment, I'd like you to tell us about something that you've done as a real life case on stage.
So, when I give a talk, I sometimes, at some point during the talk, I'll stop the talk and I'll uh, address the audience and say, Imagine that I came up to you and I asked you to come on stage with me and I gave you a choice. You can either um, take over the job of speaking for me, so you give the rest, of this presentation, talk about whatever you want to talk about, or I ask you questions for that same duration of time. Uh, and then I ask for a show of hands um, to see who would pick monologuing versus dialoguing. And maybe before I give the results of what people tend to pick, the listeners should just in their heads make a choice, see what they would register, what they would choose. Um, okay, I think I gave you long enough. That's about how long I give my audience. So I will tell you that um, I've done this with a variety of different audiences. So some are just like a room full of professional philosophers, and others are much more like public audiences, and the results are the same. Um, Namely, about three-quarters of the people pick dialogue, and one quarter, or even a little less than a quarter on average, pick monologue. So people are much more willing to have a conversation on stage than to give a speech on stage.
So I wonder why that is. I wonder why it is that people prefer dialogue. I'm guessing because you're a fan of Plato that you're going to say that dialogue leads to knowledge. I'm guessing. Whereas monologue is less likely to do so, or it's not as direct a route. I want to sort of preempt that response with an objection. I have no idea whether that is your response, but I want to preempt it and say, well, I wonder whether our expectations from a monologue are different from our expectations from a dialogue participant. So someone who's standing up and giving a monologue, we expect to be entertained, we expect the content to be accurate, we are actively looking for problems with what they're saying. Whereas in a dialogue, because it's spontaneous, we permit people to and ah, we permit people to not speak as concisely or clearly as in a monologue. And so our expectations are lower, so people feel less pressure to perform. So I want to give that as a possible answer. So it's a psychological answer rather than an epistemological answer.
That's an interesting answer. I mean, I didn't exactly directly have the Platonic answer. That would be very, very charitable in terms of thinking that everybody is a Platonist just like me, or more accurately, a Socratic just like me. My thought was that there is something that if asked to produce a monologue, your mind will draw a blank. You'd be like, what should I talk about? I don't know. Even though you could talk about anything. Um, that feels less liberating than a situation where the other person could ask you anything they wanted. Right? So you might have thought, well, if I command myself to speak, I can choose the topic, I can make it suited to me and say whatever I'm going to sound the best on. But it's somehow very hard to find that. It's hard for me to navigate to the place where I will then speak well. Whereas it's somehow much easier to do that if somebody else is prompting me. Um, Now, you might say, let me address your point about expectations. I mean, in a way that just pushes the question back. That is, we are apparently much more willing to listen to dialogues than to monologues, if you're right, right? For monologue, we've got these high standards. It better be concise, there better be no ums and ahs, better be engaging and interesting. Whereas for dialogue, our standards are lower. That is, we're more accepting. That would suggest, your theory would suggest, we're more accepting dialogue than monologue. And then that's just then the question of why is that true, right? why do we welcome dialogue in that way, and why do we require a monologue to, meet this very high standard?
So I have a feeling that maybe we shouldn't be undervaluing the quality of dialogue. We've run this show now for 5 years, and I, without a doubt, have had more fabulous insights due to the conversational format than I have from, watching people lecture. I think that the joy of dialogue is being able to draw out something unexpected, that you've got this improvisational character to it, that you can both take each other down paths that you might not have expected. And there's an electricity in the air that you have with a discussion that I think is different from a monologue. We found as well that having a setup of the three of us as opposed to a sort of dialogue adds something else that one of us can move the conversation forward, the other one can sort of dig deeper, one can play good cop, and the other one can sort of ask the hard questions. That there's an emotional game that happens, although philosophers are very comfortable going into dark, dangerous territory with each other in a way that's light and fun, and in a way that other people might feel less comfortable with. I wonder if you find that the insights you've had as a professional philosopher are different when, let's say, you're reading a text or watching a lecture versus having an electric conversation with some colleagues.
Yeah, I think it is very different. And I think you kind of zoned in on the crucial thing, which is the element of surprise. So part of what it is to be a philosopher is to train yourself in simulating dialogue. That I think that's what philosophy grad school is. And when you're trying to write a philosophy journal article, what are you doing? You're thinking to yourself in your head, how are people going to respond to this? What is the referee going to say? You're trying to anticipate their objections and then put a response to those objections in your text, so that then they won't have the objection. In fact, that's exactly what Jason was doing a minute ago, right? He was like anticipating a point and responding to it for me, right? So that is what philosophers do. And so in some way you might think what our whole training and our whole profession is about transcending dialogue. It's about internalizing the other inside of our heads. And yet we can't do it. That is, even we who are, I think we're the best at this. We're pros at this thing. And even as pros, we find that, I mean, when you actually send the paper out to the referee, when you actually go and give the talk that you have prepared for so long, people come up with objections you didn't think of. They surprise you. So basically, it's really hard to surprise yourself. um, and in particular, I think we even sort of strive not to surprise ourselves. That is, we guide ourselves away from the danger zones of like the really devastating objections to our own views. And other people won't have that courtesy to us. And so it's just the conversation is more likely to go somewhere interesting.
That's very interesting. It's sort of like tickling yourself. You can't. Um, and the joy from being tickled, or the agony, the delicious agony, is something you can only experience at the hands of someone else. Um, is the idea that philosophical exploration is something like that?
A little bit, but I also think maybe it's worth contrasting. So like if you think about a person by themselves, right? Just imagine a person, there's no one else around. And what are they going to do? We can imagine monologue as like the vocalized version of somebody by themselves. And if you think about what we do when we're by ourselves, you might reminisce about something, you might fantasize about something, you might daydream. You're very likely actually going to try to find something that will consume your attention, like a book or a movie or a phone to scroll through or whatever. Or your mind might just like wander from one thing to the next. And with the wandering, you might go to somewhere unexpected, right? So if you just let the mind wander, it could land somewhere unexpected. Um, but I think even if it did land somewhere unexpected, you wouldn't be surprised by it. Because there you would be, right? You don't notice that you've landed somewhere unexpected because you landed yourself there. So if we think about all these various things that the mind does on its own, and you imagine them being vocalized out loud, like they would be so boring. Like, you wouldn't want to hear this thing that I've just described, right? So the monologue that you give as a speech has to be really different from just what the mind does when left to its own devices. There's like a huge distance there between, I think, a monologue and what the mind does when left to its own devices. And maybe there's actually less of a distance with the dialogue.
Just out of interest, is there not an analog to writing a novel? So when you write a novel, you write it by yourself. There are collaborations that have happened, but traditionally novelists are singular creatures. They're lonesome creatures who write their novels. There is all sorts of dialogue that gets generated inside the novel, and there's multiple characters that interact with one another. Can't you imagine one model for doing philosophy is like that? And that does seem like Platonic dialogue almost. So Plato sits there and thinks about what all these different points of views are and puts them in the mouths of different interlocutors and gets them to talk, to discuss. That sounds quite similar to what a novelist does, but it all happens inside the novelist's head, or in this case, in Plato's head.
I think that the thing it's closer to is maybe writing science fiction, because the science fiction writer has to always think about the objections that people will make to the coherence and conceivability of the world that he's creating. But if you're like a writer like Emile Zola or something, and you're just, writing about coal miners in some part of France, and you've done your research, you've gone there, you've gone down the coal mine, right? So you have the information. Then you don't need to keep the critic kind of in the corner of your mind who is going to be saying there's something wrong with this. But I think Plato does need to do that. So when he has Socrates responding to Thrasymachus in the book 1 of the Republic, Plato has to be thinking, but my readers are going to say, no, here's the really good objection that you didn't consider. This dialogue is stupid because I can easily come up with the thing that refutes Socrates, and you didn't put that in your dialogue. So I think that most novelists don't have to do that because most novelists are writing about what they, in some sense, know. Like, they might have to do research like Zola did. Or they might just write about, like nowadays, novelists just write about their own lives, right? So it's very safe. But I do think science fiction may be a little bit like the counterexample, because you're going out on a limb, and you may violate the laws of physics or the laws of economics or something. You may describe something that is that your readers find sort of incoherent, and then that is something I think you have to keep in mind.
So there's a sense in which you can have an elevated discussion with friends and peers, but they're not necessarily philosophical. So what are the things that you think make a philosophical life different from the ordinary ways in which people engage with each other? I mean, it could be that you could while away your time gossiping about people. That wouldn't feel like it's generating any deep philosophical insight, but that there, I assume, a certain demeanor that you could adopt or a certain way of being that's more likely to kind of lead to a philosophical insider way of being.
I guess maybe the first word I would use is serious. What I mean by that is there's something you're trying to know. There's something you're trying to figure out. And, you had this like while away the time. So that's the contrast. You wouldn't be whiling away the time. You would be lamenting the fact that time is passing because that limits the amount of time you have left to achieve your goal. So I think of inquiry as a process that aims at an end, the end being knowledge. What philosophy does is it allows us to use our leisure time for that purpose. So I see a philosophical life as a life that devotes its leisure time to the end of inquiry.
But the search for knowledge, or the aim of knowledge, although it might seem necessary to philosophical discussion, doesn't seem sufficient. So we can imagine people searching for certain types of knowledge that we don't consider philosophical knowledge, and we don't consider that process to be philosophical. For example, scientists discussing plate tectonics. We think that there might be some philosophy associated with plate tectonics theoretically, but not that those scientists are involved in. They're just interested in, is this plate moving in this direction or that direction, and at what speed? That's a search for knowledge, and it involves a dialogue between different scientists, but it's not philosophical.
I agree. So in my book, I identify the species of knowledge that's relevant, and that is knowledge of answers to what I call untimely questions, where these are the questions, the answers to which we've always been assuming in the living of our lives. So there are questions about like what I should do, what I should care about, how I should spend my time, what's important, what's worth devoting myself to. Broadly speaking, um, I think we could say it's ethics. But I also recognize in myself a bit of an ethical bias. That is, as a philosopher, I am more interested in ethics. And I think that I've sort of become convinced that there are philosophers for whom the fundamental questions are like, where are we? What is this place that we're in? How does it work? And so I do think that there's space for those being philosophical questions. I don't think it's, we have to identify philosophy with ethics, but I'm inclined to do that. That's where I tend to see the philosophical questions. With the plate tectonics, like I could well imagine a case where there is some assumption that um, the group of scientists have been operating under about like what plates are. And then there's some moment at which someone is causing them to question that and to rethink the kind of fundamentals of the sort of building blocks that they're operating with, even in asking and answering questions. And then that would, I think, qualify as philosophical under this second theoretical tranche or something of philosophical inquiry. So I could imagine such a case, but most everyday inquiries about plate tectonics are not going to be such a case.
So it feels to me like one of the great tragedies of people's lives is that they misvalue things in a very profound way. So they chase after experiences or people or events that are kind of not valuable. So if you think about people who, spend an enormous amount of time so they can go and get a Lamborghini or a, Louis Vuitton handbag, it feels kind of like an empty thing to have, dedicated your life towards. And I suppose philosophers are uniquely good at thinking about what is valuable. If ethics is about, leading a good life or treating people well, that's one of those normative important questions. And then we've had someone like Thad Metz on the show who's, thought about the meaning of life. Is it about the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness, and the kind of attitude that you have towards it? And it feels like if you've only got one life, you really want to work out quite quickly what are the valuable things that are worth pursuing so that you can do them. Otherwise, you're sort of squandering your time. What are the things that you think philosophy is good at unearthing? What are the valuable things that we should care about?
So I'm an intellectualist, so I think my answer is knowledge. But like I think the fundamental human problem is that we haven't worked out what the valuable things are. And we can look at the person who devotes themselves to amassing Lamborghinis and feel superior, but that's a very illusory superiority because we can say, well, I'm sure it's not Lamborghinis, right? But that doesn't mean I know what it is, right? That's an indeterminate negation. Um, and I could be just as badly off as the person who's going off pursuing those Lamborghinis, but feel very superior because I know I'm not making that mistake. Right? But there's a lot of mistakes to be made, and so I think that the intellectualist picture, I wouldn't call it tragic exactly, but I would call it a little bit of a downer, in that we're probably going to have to live our whole lives not knowing what we should pursue. That's kind of a shock, right? Because you think, like you just said, look, we got to work it out fast. And really, that that speaks to something very natural but very dangerous in sort of like the human temperament. It's like, well, I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing, so I want to get that down quickly, like the first 20 years or so, and then I can pursue it once I know what it is. And but what if you're not going to know? Like, what if you're going to die not knowing? Then how do you live? That's what intellectualism is about. It's about how do you live your life when you don't know how to live your life. And it's such a downer that some people might give up, and they're like, well, forget it, maybe I'll never know, I should just pick something or whatever. I don't think we should give up. I think we should be inquiring. That is, we can make progress, we can come to grasp the value of certain things. We don't know that we're right, but we have reason to think we're right, and we have more reason than we had earlier, and our grasp of those values can become more stable. And so we stand to make progress in our grasp of what's valuable, but I don't think that project's going to be ending anytime soon. And so I think we just have to devote ourselves to it as completely as possible, which is to say, with all of our leisure time. And yeah, that's what I think philosophy's for.
I mean, that's very interesting. Mark mentioned Thad Metz earlier, and Thad has a case, not meant as a counterexample to intellectualism, but I think could be applied. So the case is the pig farmer. So the pig farmer, he has pigs, and all he does all day is he either births more pigs from those pigs, or he slaughters the pigs and sells the meat. And when he gets older, he passes on his pig farming business to his children, who grow more pigs and slaughter more pigs and get more pigs from their pigs indefinitely. And the goal of this business is just to have a bigger and bigger pig farm. And the question is, why farm the pigs? If your answer to why farm the pigs is to get more pigs, it seems like you haven't provided a good reason to have the pigs in the first place. There needs to be some sort of external reaching out of the system. And my worry with the idea that the ultimate value in life is intellectualism, or the ultimate value that you should pursue in your life as intellectualism, is that I wonder whether there's a similar circularity or systemic sort of lack of reaching out. So you've got the system, but it's not reaching out. So what is a lot of this intellectual knowledge about? It's about trying to work out the kind of life that we should live. And you could spend all your time trying to work out the kind of life that we should live without living it. And so it's not reaching out of that system. It's just like, it's assuming that the pursuit of looking for how to live your life is intrinsically valuable, but it seems like that's an extrinsic value. And unless you actually land up with an answer that can be pursued in a punctual fashion, so quite early on in your life, like Mark suggests, that it's not worth even beginning the process. And you mentioned before that some people might just pick a value, right? So they might just pick a strategy and then pursue it. And you dismiss that. But why dismiss that? Surely an arbitrary picking in itself might reward that pursuit with some value. So it might not have intrinsic value in and of itself, but just the fact that I've picked it and want it and then pursue it might in itself give it some value. So let's say I pick that my value in life is travel, and then I just start traveling. And then later, the intellectualists have done a deep dive into travel, and they've decided, actually, it's not even on the top 10. It's not even on the top 10 list of goods that there are. The fact that I chose it and then pursue it, that seems to be valuable in and of itself. Because my life has been oriented around a project, it's given me a reason to get up in the morning, etc., etc. So I wonder whether the arbitrary picking of a value, even if it turns out not to be the ultimate value, and then pursuing that is not a better enterprise than spending all your time trying to work out what that value is.
Good. I think that's the great existentialist hope. It's interesting to think about how quickly we assume that the person with the Lamborghini somehow didn't manage to achieve it, right? Because he went for Lamborghinis, but we're like, well, that's tragic that he somehow he failed to invest the Lamborghinis with a sufficient amount of value, right? So I guess I think that it's just not true that stuff becomes valuable because.
By the way, I didn't share Mark's intuition on the Lamborghini. So I mean, I don't have Lamborghinis and I don't pursue Lamborghinis, but when he mentioned the Lamborghinis, I thought, imagine you spend your whole life trying to save up for this Lamborghini. Like you choose that as your value, and you pursue it relentlessly, and then you get the Lamborghini, and you just savor every hand stitched element of the seat and the dashboard and the wooden paneling, and that seems like it's a pretty valuable aesthetic experience.
Maybe you can remember your own childhood, or maybe you have children, because if so, you go through this experience many times with a child where there's something they want more than anything. They're just desperate. There's this, their heart's desire, and they really are thrilled when they get it for like maybe an hour, or I don't know, a week if you're lucky. I think that there's a way in which, I mean, that's what I would predict with the Lamborghini person, which is like they spent all this time and then they really would be thrilled with it. But then at a certain moment, it would kind of fall flat. And people have like midlife crises and things precisely because the things they spent so long to achieve then don't satisfy them in the ways in which they expected. And that's because they had standards. They weren't just like, well, if I value it, that'll make it valuable. It's like, no, I wanted something from it and I'm not getting that. If we just suppose that they do get it, like, let's just say they get the Lamborghini and they're really happy. It might not be that different from the pig farmer. I mean, it's like, they're like, look, this is what we do. We have pigs. And I mean, why it even has to grow, I'm not sure why that's part of the example. Maybe they just want it to continue. And they're like, we're happy with it continuing. What more do you want from us? It's pretty similar kind of case. And we're coming at them from the outside saying, well, that's not good enough for me. There's a way in which my book is only addressed to people who have that thought in the first place. And, you know, for all we know, this person has knowledge, the pig farmer, and this is it. And they're doing the thing they're supposed to do. If we don't have knowledge, we can't know they don't, right? Unless we can talk to them. And so the thought is just, well, what if you are the kind of person who is liable to fall into the Lamborghini tragedy? That is, who's liable to throw yourself into the pursuit of something and then realize it doesn't really fulfill you. So you have a predicament. And the question is, how do you live given this predicament? I want to address the point about whether the intellectualism is kind of insular. And I think it isn't. It's actually, this is one of the strong points of intellectualism by contrast with some other ethical theories. So I think you can very well ask, like, of the Kantian, why follow the moral law? Of the utilitarian, why maximize utility? For the Aristotelian, why exhibit the virtues? That is, they have just a thing, and you just got to do that thing, keep doing that thing. And they're kind of stuck in the world of that fundamental principle. But for one thing, the intellectualist thinks the question, why should we pursue knowledge, is a great question. And that's one of the things they want to inquire into. So it's not like forbidden to ask that. And it's not, it's in fact an avenue of inquiry for intellectualists, and it shows up in the Socratic dialogues. But also, intellectualism is a form of, I don't know if non-ideal theory is the right word, but you are pursuing knowledge, not the journey is not the destination. You want knowledge. And once you have knowledge, you're going to know what to do with it because you have knowledge, right? And so it really does point outside itself to the life lived with knowledge, which would be the ideal life. Now you want to say, well, but along the way, we don't get to live our lives well. The crucial thing is that you do make progress. And so you live your life better. You're closer to being guided by knowledge if what you have are, for instance, answers to fundamental questions that are at least stable over time, that don't like contradict each other from one moment to the next, as the Lamborghini person does, right? When they're like, the most important thing is Lamborghinis. Oh no, wait, they're not important, right? That's the kind of difficulty that you get yourself into. And so you do come to be guided more and more by something that is stable. And thus you're able to live better and live something like closer to living in the light of knowledge, but you're not going to get the perfect thing. So yeah, okay, those are just some of those.
So one way of thinking about it is that it could be a personal journey that you go through, or it could be that certain people are very good at asking the deep questions, and other people are very good at experiments and living. Um, and maybe what you have to do is sort of think about the goal of achieving knowledge not as only an individual goal, but as a kind of humanitarian goal. So you want a variety of people to be able to do the unusual, unexpected thing because it might churn up something that the rest of us didn't know about. You might think, for example, that in the last couple of years there's been kind of explosion in terms of the sorts of relationships that people are willing to consider. So polyamory has suddenly become one of these, hot topic ways of being, and was very taboo for a long time. People who said, well, the best way of being is to find the person that you love, settle down with them, and then die with them. And that, because people have had experience in living, they've had multiple partners or different ways of exploring a romantic life. They've been able to inspire others to do that. And you might think that it's partly philosophical action, in other words, taking the risk of living this out, and the other one is thinking about what are those valuable things, like what is the best way to to love, or are there a variety of reasonable ways to love? Um, do you think that the sort of Socratic views on love kind of can give us some ideas about what we could be doing better?
It's interesting because I think, and as I sort of argue in my book, I mean, you have a defense of polyamory already in Socratic texts. Um, and so there's a question, which is the tail and which is the dog between the experiment and the idea? I do think that a Socratic approach to love, let's say, could guide your experimentation because it would keep you focused on what's important. The thing about an experiment is you have to know which things you want to vary, right? So, you could try expressing your love in different tones of voice, or wearing different clothes when you express your love, right? There's so many different things you could vary. Which of them would be relevant? Which of them would be significant to loving this person better? You need some kind of grasp of what the basic thing is that you're doing when you're loving someone in order to be productively experimenting. And I do think that Socrates gives us that, because what we have, like, let's say in the world that we live in, we kind of have this cloud associated with love. Here I'm talking specifically about romantic love. So we have stuff like dating and sex and having children and getting married and saying I love you and going on like romantic outings and having shared projects and having a mortgage, and having a domestic routine, right? So these are all things that like are in the cloud of love. But everything I've just described, you could imagine a marriage, a love that has all of them, but is a bad one, right? That is, it's consistent with meeting all those benchmarks that I just said, that the people don't get along at all. And so Socrates wanted to identify what's the thing in the middle that you just really need to have, where, it's not going to be sex, and it's not going to be children. It's not going to be saying I love you, and it's not going to be the mortgage. What is it? And he thought it was being able to talk to each other. That is what he thought was, here's a case you're not going to be able to give me. Here's two people. They really can grasp, can understand each other at a deep level. They can really talk to each other, but they don't love each other. So he thought the ability to have excellent conversations and understand each other is sort of inseparable from love, in that you can't have that and hate each other, something like that. Whereas you could have all the other things and hate each other. That's not quite as strong as saying you can't love each other without it. And so I didn't say that, if you noticed. I only insisted in the one direction. I think Socrates himself might go a little further, but that at the very least, I'm prepared to defend that direction.
Okay, two objections in the spirit of Socratic dialogue. So the first is, you said we make progress in the intellectual life, in figuring out what's important. Do we make progress though? Some people will say, well, these questions have been asked since ancient times. We know closer than we were. Do we make progress? Isn't this just a fool's errand? So that's the first objection. Second objection, I may be misunderstanding your position, so just correct me if I'm wrong here. But you asked for a case where two people can deeply understand each other through dialogue, through conversation, and not love each other. It depends on what you mean by love. But I imagine two types of cases. The one would be friendship. It seems like you could have two friends who deeply understand each other through conversation, but don't love each other in a romantic way. But I'm sure here you're going to talk about different types of love that the Greeks talked about. The second would be two enemies. So two enemies who really go at it through conversation and really gain deep insight into one another, but definitely by definition don't love each other.
Great. Okay, so do we make progress? So I think yes, and we make two kinds of progress. The one kind is at an individual level over the course of your life. There are things you come to understand better as you have a variety of conversations about them. Plato tries to illustrate that with Socrates by having Socrates actually list those claims in certain places. So, for instance, towards the end of the Gorgias, he's like, here are the things that I have tied down with arguments of iron and adamant. And they're counterintuitive claims like, doing injustice is worse than suffering it. You should never use flattery for any purpose. Everyone desires the good. There's no such thing as weakness of will. It's always better to be good than to appear good, etc. There's a bunch of them, and that's Socrates' progress over the course of his life. You too could make that kind of progress if you had conversations. So that's the first. That's individual progress. Then there's collective progress. Now, the thing that's cited against collective progress is we're still asking these questions. That's evidence that we have not yet arrived at knowledge, but it's not evidence that we haven't made any progress. So I think the evidence that we've made progress is like, what are the forms of moral awakening that we've seen, say, over the past 2,500 years? I would cite as like Exhibit A, human rights. I think that was huge for us. We did not, the people that I study in the ancient world, that wasn't on the scene yet. They didn't have the idea that there is something about a human being that is inalienable and that constrains how you're permitted to treat them. That was a hard-won insight, through sort of Christianity and then the Enlightenment. I think that's progress. It's still ongoing. It's, as my kids' teachers would say, an emerging skill. We are still figuring out exactly what these rights are, why we have them, what they entail, and how to treat one another in accordance with the right kind of respect for them. So I don't think we're not at the end of that journey, but I think we've definitely made progress. And I think it's progress in ideas. That is, we came to understand something that we didn't understand earlier. Now your two counterexamples, the friends and the enemies. So it's an interesting, if you think about the relationship between eros, which is what my topic was, sort of romantic love, and philia, which is a broader category that includes friendship. Philia is just going to include every kind of love for the Greeks. That we all, us and Socrates, we all agree in an entailment that goes one way, which is that eros entails philia. So we would think it's really weird if a married couple was like, we're not friends at all. Like, we love each other and we have kids and whatever, we have a great life, but we're not friends, right? So we think that romantic love entails friendship. We tend to think the entailment doesn't go the other way. And Socrates disagreed about that. That is, he thinks if somebody is really your friend, like if they're really deeply your friend, if you really love them as a friend, then you're going to be concerned with their personal transformation in the way that is characteristically erotic. By erotic, what he means is not sexual, but is the kind of love that is plays in the sphere of transcendence. The kind of love where we seek from it the desire to be transformed into better versions of ourselves and to help other people transform. That's what he means by the erotic. And he thinks, like, people have kind of centralized sexual activity in that kind of love to a degree that's like a bit of a mistake. That's why you get the idea of platonic love. Socrates is not opposed to sex. He doesn't think it's bad, but he thinks that they've misidentified the core of what makes something erotic. And he thinks that if you really understood friendship, it's going to be a bidirectional entailment. So yes, he would say that those friends, if they can really talk to each other, and by really is now, it's a high bar, that's going to include the kind of transformation that would make it erotic. The enemies is a really interesting case. So there is, there's a moment in the Gorgias where Socrates' interlocutors get annoyed at him for review, and they see him as their enemy for doing that. And he's like, but I would love it if you did that to me, because I think that refuting someone is the best benefit that you can give them. That is the most loving thing you can do to someone, is to refute them. But we live in a funny mixed up world where maybe you're most inclined to do that if you're someone's enemy. And so I think there's like a funny way in which you could imagine a pair of enemies that would then come to count as loving each other Socratically from Socrates' point of view. Like, they could use hostile tones of voice or something. Socrates wouldn't mind the hostile tones of voice. He wouldn't mind them saying, I'm your worst enemy, or something like that. If they really set out to systematically refute one another and to ensure of the other that they are held to the standard of the truth and living their life with that dedication to the other person, but conceiving of it as enemyship of some kind, I think Socrates would say, well, that's a very loving kind of enemy.
I really like that idea that you could have this like soulmate. You're both deeply invested in something from different sides, and it might be the kind of thing where the war of ideas or with each other yields all this incredible good. And you could imagine, utilitarians and Kantians sort of, fighting to the death over like, what is the right thing to do, and through that sort of like fierce debate, you wind up, shedding more light on both ideas. I mean, that's part of why we have a combative stance on the show, is we think that clashing swords is a good way to find out what's true. There is a sense, so my main job is that I'm a lawyer. And so, I have certain adversaries who, specialize in the narrow area of law that I do. And there are only, I don't know, about 20 people in South Africa who do free speech and hate speech, which is what I specialize in. And we're often on other, different sides of the battle, but there's a kinship in it because we both really care about what the law will look like, and we want to shape it from our different sides. And there's a sense in which our enemies are those who understand it the best. And so there is a kind of twisted love that's in that relationship. And I think you probably find that in academia as well, where people who duke it out over a particular idea, and will say, that's my fiercest opponent, there is a certain kind of love in that. And I suppose the question is whether it has to be a civil love or whether it can be a sort of heated, animosity. Do you think then maybe in our personal relationships, we should be trying to allow for more kind of fertile disagreement, that the idea of like loving each other through opposition is something that people are often uncomfortable with, that they feel like, you need to be supportive and nice and agree with people and say, you got this, as opposed to saying, no, I think you're wrong. And I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. And it's for these reasons. It's something that philosophers seem much more comfortable with doing. But often, if you have philosophers around a table and some non-philosopher sort of sees what's going on, they're distressed. They say, why do you guys hate each other? What's going on? Can't I make it better? Can't we soothe all the negative feelings?
Right. So there's a lot of fear over disagreeing. And Mark, you and I were talking about this before we started the recording, where I think that there's this thought that any disagreement, if sort of left to its own devices, could degenerate into murder. There's like a worst case scenario where we just kill each other over this disagreement. And like, this sounds crazy to us, civilized people living in this, but like, this was a thing people did in the ancient world. Like, that you had killed someone was like the norm for an adult man, right? So this is not like we're the weird ones that this sounds absurd to us. But deep in our cultural makeup is the thought that disagreement leads to murder. And we're trying to stave that off. And we're trying to reassure each other all the time, no, it's okay. We're definitely not going to murder each other. Like this, we're all going to get along. This is fine. And I think philosophers are just, we're unusually accustomed to safe disagreement. That is, we know we're not going to murder each other. But even philosophers, when sometimes like people have remarked to me when they're at like a philosophy talk, they're like, why does everyone say they have a worry? Like, I have a worry about this. Like, it's like Columbo, you know? Oh, I just have one question, right? They're not like, here's my objection. It's like, even philosophers, we're not as straightforward as we could be. We try to couch it in non-confrontational, sort of polite language. And so there's just something very difficult about intellectual confrontation. There's a problem that has to be solved about it. And that's the problem of how to see that it is actually an attempt to benefit one another. And, you know, this is the thing that for Socrates was just obvious. It was just a matter of course. If I found it confusing that people thought he was trying to hurt them when he was objecting to them. But that is very much for I think for people who are maybe not used to the thought that intellectual disagreement can actually resolve the question. They think at the end of the day, it's going to be the aggression of somebody's point of view over somebody else's. I have a friend who's a philosopher, and she told me she teaches a lot of like controversial topics, like you know, things about trans rights or environmental ethics or abortion or whatever, where there's like strong divides in the classroom, strong disagreements. And she said she notices more and more that when somebody will state their opinion, and somebody who has like the opposite opinion will be like, your opinion is valid. They'll say that to each other. They're like, that's valid opinion, right? And the conversation will kind of end there. And she wants to say, no, you disagree with them. Like, say what you think, you know, fight it out, right? And what they want to do is be like, it's all valid, it's fine, we can get along, we're not going to kill each other. So that's I think that's definitely kind of an obstacle to be overcome. And you see why they're doing this thing of it's valid, but it does get in the way of pursuing the inquiry.
I like your explanation of it's valid as a way of avoiding death and murder. I live half my life in Thailand, and I've discovered a different reason why people avoid intellectual confrontation. I think it's different. This is me couching my objection in a way that makes it sound better. And that is saving face. So something that's very important in a lot of Eastern cultures, or a lot of people who belong to Eastern cultures, I don't want to say everyone because I don't believe in those kind of solid social groups, but something that's important to a lot of people is this idea that they should not lose face. So when you argue against someone, and suppose you were to prove them wrong, that would be embarrassing. They would lose face. And that in and of itself, even if it didn't lead to murder, that is a kind of murder. That is a shame that in a lot of Eastern culture is considered abominable. It's not something you would put another person through. And I had an experience where I was arguing recently with a government employee, and we were out on a date, but he works for the government and he has a certain political stance. And I was arguing against that political stance. And it was obvious that I won the argument because he was giving certain facts that were incorrect. And I just pointed out the inaccuracies. And I saw at some point that he lost face. And he did this. And what that means is you stop that discussion. And that was a very interesting experience. Because that's not something that I've experienced very often ever in the West. People might signal that you should stop in various ways, but never as explicitly as stop. And I think in Thailand, among many people, that is considered sort of sacrosanct. You don't cause someone to lose face.
That's great. I love that example. And what's so interesting to me about it is you say never as explicitly as, right? But even that is not explicit. He didn't say, now you must stop, right? He has a symbol. So I think you're absolutely right. So in my book, I distinguish sort of two fundamental sources of motivation. Besides for philosophical inquiry, that's the ideal case, but absent philosophy, there's two. One of them is our bodies, which are fundamentally organized around the fear of death, of death of the individual. And the other is kinship groups. They motivate us to behave in accordance with the rules of that group. And there's a kind of death there too, a kind of social death, the death of you as a member of the group. And that's what the loss of face is. And I completely agree. So I think you're right. And you're right to say that this kind of social death is maybe the more proximate thing that people are worried about. That is, yes, it could devolve. And sometimes people get really angry and it does sort of seem to like intimate violence, but maybe even there, maybe when it intimates violence, it's mostly because people are worried about the social death. That is, they're worried about how they're going to be perceived by other people, and that they're going to, be shown to be a nobody or something like that. And so I think that that's right. I think that being wrong, not being able to defend your ideas, that is something that people can think of as now I'm nobody. I think Socrates thought, sadly, that's the position we're all actually in. So it's just the truth is just being revealed. And we have to learn to take each other seriously, even when we can't defend our ideas, because that's the starting position that we're in. So at the end of the book, I talk about what sort of Socratic respect is and what Socratic egalitarianism is. And it's the ability to respect someone, to, in some sense, give them face, even if you think they're wrong, because you think that even insofar as they're wrong, in some sense, the truth is still their property. That is, they are still aiming at the truth. And insofar as you can kind of rehabilitate them as an aimer at the truth and be learning from them, even as they make a mistake, I think that can go a long way to making them regain face.
So, do you think there are ways in which someone can lead a life that is profoundly unphilosophical? So, you can imagine someone who doesn't argue to get to what's true, but as to dominate, because they like the sound of their own voice, or because they think that they can win through sophistry. I imagine that there are a number of ways in which you could squander this life by leading an unphilosophical one. What do you think the chief culprits would be?
I think most of the things you would think of are not that unphilosophical, because they're imitations of the philosophical life. So the desire to dominate people by showing them up in arguments is just like a twisted version of the desire to have knowledge and to arrive at those conclusions in the legitimate way. It's the desire to appear as though you know. Only a lover of knowledge could want to appear as though they know, right? So these people secretly, they want knowledge and they're just pursuing it in a really bad way. So it's like a deformed philosophical life. I think the maybe the pig farmer that we talked about earlier, right? I mean, somebody who is just completely contented with their life as it is, that would be unphilosophical, but it could be unphilosophical for two very different reasons. One of them is this person just doesn't care about having knowledge, and they're just they're like an animal, right? That the pig is also pursuing something like a pig life of just trying to live as long as possible and reproduce, right? And so the one extreme of an unphilosophical life would be the life of a non-human animal, and the other extreme would be the life of someone who has knowledge. If you have knowledge, you don't have to pursue it, so you're not inquiring. And you're just acting on your knowledge. And maybe the knowledge will tell us we should all be pig farmers. And then for all we know, that's what the pig farmer is doing, is acting out their philosophical knowledge. Seems unlikely, but the point is it's conceptually possible. Those two cases kind of come together at the end points. So the life that's unphilosophical is the life that doesn't contain inquiry in it in any way. I would say that the desire to dominate and be tyrannical is really quite indebted to the philosophical life. It's exactly why Socrates says to Alcibiades, when he meets Alcibiades, and he says, I know you secretly want to rule the world, and that's why I think you'll make a great philosopher.
This was a wonderful conversation, and we hope that one of the things we've managed to achieve in this conversation and on Brain Debate generally is to inspire people to lead philosophical lives and to ask questions that are uncomfortable. And I think the thing that sort of made my skin crawl the most is the idea of two people saying, like, your opinion is valid. Like, duke it out to the death. We want to find out what's actually true, and that's why we entertain many controversial topics on the show, because we think that the way to find out what's true, the way to actually get knowledge, is through deep discussion and deep disagreement. And Agnes, we think that what you're doing in this project is a wonderful one, and we implore others to pick up your book and start leading philosophical lives.